Welcome to this Sunday's episode of Coconut Oil, Stardust, and Dope Vibes. It's our Sunday moment. And this week, I'll just kind of start with the vibe and then give you the title. So, it was probably a couple years ago now. I was talking with a client friend, and she started talking about FOMO. I'm like, what is FOMO? At that point, I'd never heard of FOMO. And she's like, it's the fear of missing out. We were talking about a specific event that happens. Well, at the time, this is pre-COVID stuff, it was happening annually in Atlanta, and I was like, how do you even get an invitation to that? We started kind of talking about that, and she said, sometimes that, she has FOMO. It's like, oh gosh, I really would love to show up to this event, or, I would love to be in attendance too. And I said, I know. I said, I get that way sometimes where I look at stuff and it's like, oh man, I would love to go to that. And you kind of feel like you're missing out on these events, these happenings, these things. But then I said, I don't know. I said, is that just what we feel, or are we really missing out? I mean, sometimes there are events, happenings, things where it's like, yeah, for what you're doing, for the path you're on, it would be really great for you to be there. And you being there, like you missing out, is like, it's really a thing. I said, but some of this stuff, I'm like, I just wonder, if us having such instant access to viewing everything makes you feel like you're missing out on something, but you're really not. As I said, there's a couple events that I look at and I'm like, oh, I would really go. And I said, some stuff, yes, it's invite only or whatever. And so you kind of, maybe you feel away. But I was like, the other stuff, I'm like, if you really wanted to go, wouldn't you just pay to go? Like, I said, are we really missing out? Or is it just kind of like you look at that moment, those pictures look great, the energy looks great, it's got a beautiful aesthetic, it looks really pretty, and you're like, oh, I would have loved to be there. I know for some, FOMO goes a little deeper. But it's, I told her, I said, when you look at all of these things, there's always a thing popping up, an event popping up. Like, there's always something. And I mean, like, if you are not at everything, are you missing out? So we started really like breaking down what that message is. You know what I mean? Like, do you have to be at every event? Like, what does that net you to be everywhere all the time? Because FOMO will have you thinking, like, if you don't show up here, you're missing out on this huge experience. And it's like, but are you? Are you really? I think, and we started talking about how difficult it gets, because there's a state of kind of comparison that happens when you look at stuff. You're just like, oh, well, why am I not there? Or should I be there? Or do I need to put myself in a place where I can show up at this? You have all these comparisons because you're looking at so many things and you're flooded with so many media images. We start to really stop and think, like, am I doing enough? Am I on track? Am I where I'm supposed to be? That's like one of the number one things that people ask when they come for a reading. They're like, I'm chugging along. I'm doing what I think I'm supposed to be doing. Am I in the right space? Am I on track? Ultimately, to me, what that translates into is just kind of asking, like, am I receiving the assignment correctly? Did I hear this right? Did I perceive this right? But then, to me, it asks the question, what do you do when it's not your reaping season? Which is the topic today. It's like, what do you do when it's really not your season to be out and about socializing? What if your season is that you're supposed to be planted underground, hibernating, recharging, because your season to be out is coming, right? What if it's not your reaping season? What if it's not your season to harvest? What if it's your season to sow seed? What if it's actually your season to fertilize seed, right? Maybe it was your sowing season last season, and then this season you're supposed to actually sit and fertilize and let things move forward. Like, what if that's really what you're supposed to be doing, and you're perceiving that it's your reaping season, and you're like, oh, I'm not far enough ahead, things aren't coming together? What if it's not time yet? See, FOMO will have us thinking that it's time for something to happen when it's not. Because it's so easy to compare. It's so easy to just look and be like, oh, because we follow each other's journeys. We follow each other's kids. Some of us have never met each other's kids ever in person, but we are each other's kids' biggest cheerleaders. It's like, oh, I'm your internet auntie. This your internet niece. This your internet nephew. I'm your internet uncle. Because we follow and we cheer and we know what's going on in their lives. We see these highlights and we're like, yes. And we watch them go from elementary school to high school. We watch their growth. We watch your growth as an entrepreneur. We watch your journey. We because it's like an online diary. And so we see you move from one place to the next. And sometimes you talk about where things didn't go right. And I love the posts from people where there's transparency, and they're like, oh, today I had to do an extra prayer because it wasn't working. Things weren't working for me. And so I had, this didn't work out. I invested over here and this didn't do what I wanted it to do. It didn't yield what I wanted it to yield. And so we're back to the drawing board and we're still behind you. We're just like cheering and we're like, yes. And then we see the fruits of the labor come to harvest, and we're there with you. We're there with you. And so we see sometimes people in their sowing season, we see them in their fertilizing season, and then we see them in their harvest. But sometimes we don't get to see that full picture. And I think sometimes we forget that full picture has to happen for ourselves, and we want to jump straight to the reaping season. We want to jump straight to the harvest. And that's not how that works. There is a little discomfort in that in between. There is a little discomfort in that waiting, in that patience for that seed to grow. There is a little discomfort in that. But I feel like there's this space where we have to be quite honest with ourselves and understanding that comparison, us comparing ourselves to someone else, it only leaves us with our eyes on someone else's assignment. Our eyes are on somebody else's paper. I don't know what they're doing. I remember back in grade school, when teachers first kind of got hip, everybody would get the same quiz. And then, somebody could, I hated when I would see somebody kind of try to cheat off your paper, right? So somebody could, look over, grab your answer if they didn't have the answer or whatever and put it down. But then teachers got hip and started alternating the test. They would have like 2 to 3 different versions of the test. So your neighbor would never have the same test that you do. So there was no way you could look over on their paper and snatch their answer, right? And so what we have to come to understand when we start comparing ourselves to others is that we're essentially looking at somebody else's paper. Let me snatch their answer. Let me see how they're doing things. Let me see what they're doing. Let me grab what they have. Let me grab their ashe. Let me grab their energy. Let me grab all of that so I can present to the world something that looks like a finished product, because I'm not where I want to be. I don't feel like I'm far enough along. So let me do this. And that's crazy. That's crazy because number one, you don't know what they've done to get to that point. A lot of the things that we see nowadays are smoke and mirrors. It looks great. You got filters, you got reels. With reels, you can take a whole day's worth of footage and put it in a 15-second montage that makes it look like everything was fabulous. Same with your stories, same with your posts. Like, we have all of these ways to edit life. And so then you'll sit and you'll look at somebody else's paper and be like, but what you're really looking at is edited life. You haven't really looked at their whole assignment. They haven't been transparent. They haven't talked about the pitfalls. They haven't talked about the fact that they haven't really climbed out of the dungeon just yet. They're not all the way out of the in-between. They haven't climbed out of that yet. They've just peeked their head out and you're like, oh my gosh, look at this. They peeked their head out and they've given you a bunch of edits. And then that's what you're actually comparing your life to. You're comparing your life to their edits. None of that is real. And then sometimes some of us will say, but that's okay. I really want to have this thing. I really want to do this thing. At what cost, though? At the cost of your integrity, the cost of creating detours for yourself that are absolutely unnecessary. This is why I don't truly subscribe to or believe in imposter syndrome. Excuse me, imposter syndrome was something that was coined in like late 80s, early 90s. I think it was more the late 80s though, and it talked about feeling like, oh my gosh, I'm in this space. I've made it to this space, but do I deserve it? I can have all the accolades and the degrees and the knowledge, but do I really belong here? I feel like people get to that space when they're either living an inauthentic life where they've got their eyes on someone else's paper and they're not following their own purpose, right? I feel like we have a lot of these conversations when people buck against the whole notion of purpose. When you understand your purpose, when you are confident in your purpose and you are accepting 100% of it, you don't really have imposter syndrome. Do you have those moments where you're like, God, what you just set on my plate is bigger than I've ever imagined in my life? Yes, you have those moments, because 9 times out of 10, what God is going to put on your plate is way bigger than what you ever could imagine for yourself. And that's okay. What happens with imposter syndrome, though, is like you feel like that there's this fake version of you living in this space where it's like, oh, I really don't belong here. You don't feel like that when you're really working in your purpose. When I'm in my purpose, I'm not really necessarily looking at other people and saying, what are they doing or how are they doing it? I think what happens is business-wise, and I've had this conversation with a couple other mystics and spiritualists. Business-wise, there's this one thing that says, your business has to look like this. You have to have a business plan. You have to do this, this, this. And if you don't do these things, it means that you failed or things haven't come to fruition. And when you're running a business based on spiritually on your purpose, sometimes God gives you a different assignment midway. And so you have to kind of scrap where you were going and try to, and then kind of go in a different direction. And I don't think business plans necessarily account for that. And so then that becomes difficult, because when you look at something business wise, they'll say, oh, you failed, or you didn't, get to where you were supposed to be according to a certain timeline. So that can make you feel like, did I miss something? Did I miss the assignment? Was this off? Was I not where I was supposed to be? And the reality is you actually just went ahead and followed suit and gave in to the fact that your assignment changed, which is not actually a bad thing. It's more so the way that we're supposed to go. But then we have, like I say, we have FOMO, that fear of missing out, that fear that, like, I didn't go in a space where I was supposed to go. But were you supposed to go there? Were you supposed to be there? Were you asked to be there? Were you invited to be there? Is that really what you were supposed to be doing? I think when we can keep our eyes on our own paper, think about that whole analogy of being in school. When you have your eyes on your own paper and you're confident that you know all of the things that the test is asking you, you're not really looking at, let me see it, I studied. I know all this stuff. I know the material. I'm not looking at anybody else's paper. Because then when I look at it that way, I'm like, they might be messing up. And I'm over here looking at their paper, and I even put the wrong stuff on my paper when I know exactly what the answer is. There is no reason for me to look over here, because I'm confident that I'm doing what I'm supposed to be doing according to my test. I know the answers. When you're confident like that, you don't look over and say, well, is this other person going to do right? Or do they have the answers? Do they have it together? You're not worried about that. You're like, oh, let me just go ahead and finish my test. When you're confident with the answers, you don't look around to somebody else and say, well, shoot, I finished too early. If I finished too early, does that mean that I didn't have the answers right? No. I already know that these are the answers. I went ahead and I computed them. I wrote them down. And it doesn't matter that it takes somebody else a little longer. Maybe it takes somebody else longer to process the questions. Maybe they're overthinking. When we're clear on what our reaping season is, when we're clear on our divine knowledge and our divine path, we spend way less time looking at other people's stuff. We spend less time comparing. Is it human nature to do it? Of course. But somehow you kind of course correct and you get back into the context of what you have going on, and you go ahead and you go on that course. You stay the course. So what do you do when it's not your reaping season? What do you do when it's time for somebody else's season and it's not yours? Patience. That's hard. It's not easy, and I'm saying it and I'm not minimizing it. It's not easy. Patience and persistence. You have to work. You have to serve. You should be in a place of service while you're waiting for your harvest to come to light. Sometimes it just means that you just need to be a little quiet and sit still. That watch pot never boils. So sometimes you just need to be quiet and sit still and just wait. You need to take your hands off of whatever the situation is and not try to, evoke anything or push anything along. What do you do when it's not your reaping season? You congratulate other people when it's theirs, sincerely. You send them positive energy, sincerely. You study. You wait. You sit in prayer. You meditate. There are other things that you could be doing when you're waiting for your harvest to come. Because there's nothing that you can do. Like, you can't dig up. Think about this with farming. It's like you can fertilize, you can water, you can make sure the soil is right, you create all the right conditions for growth. But I mean, you can't physically grow that seed. It's up to the seed to grow. All you can do is create the conditions for that harvest to come. That's it. There's nothing else you can do. You can't reach into the seed and pull it out, or you can't do any of that. It's going to come when it's ready. And so you have to have other things to do in that time. You could be planting elsewhere. You could be nurturing. You could be resting. You could be preparing for what it's like to actually, gather the harvest. When the harvest comes to light, I mean, do you have the wheelbarrow ready, or do you have a shaky wheelbarrow and you don't have anything to pick your harvest? There are other things that you could be doing, other spaces where your energy and your thought energy and your heart energy are necessary. So this Sunday, I'm asking you, do you have your eyes on your own paper? Are you focused on your own assignment? Or are you more focused on the fact that you feel like you should be somewhere else? You should be a little bit more further along. If you're feeling the latter, I want you to really look at clearly what your purpose is, what your assignment is, what you're supposed to be doing. What are you supposed to be doing? Extract yourself from everybody else. Extract yourself from looking at everybody else and comparing yourself to everybody else. Because when we do that, we've put ourselves in a race that no one else is racing. No one else has joined you in that race. It's just you by yourself. So I want you to start to look at these things and make sure that you do what you have to do to be on target, so you're prepared when your season comes to harvest. Thank you for joining me today on this Sunday moment. Thank you for joining me for the past few weeks on the Sunday moments. These will continue. I'm following assignment. These will continue. Please make sure that you share the Sunday moment. If there's a word that resonates, share it, hashtag, tag me on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter, so we can continue the conversation throughout the week. I hope it's continued inspiration for you every week when you tune in. And make sure you go back into the archives of Coconut Oil, Stardust, and Dope Vibes and check out all the earlier episodes.